Hi, this is Ben Llewellyn. Today I'm talking about the Old Prussian language. What is it and what was it? Hey, hit that subscribe button. I made this video because down in the comments on my Lithuanian video, this guy or woman, Fringe History, said that this would be a really good video, and I thought about that, and that's a really good idea. Hey, so just thanks for coming to my channel. Hit that like button, subscribe, help me do this, bring this to more people. And if you want to have a certain bit of content, hey, let me know. We'll talk about it and we'll get the content that you want on this channel, because it's not just about me here. I need you to help build this community at Ben Llewellyn with me. Old Prussian is a member of the Baltic languages. There are two branches of the Baltic languages: the Western branch, which is all extinct, including Old Prussian, and the Eastern branch, which is Lithuanian and Latvian, which has survived. There were other languages in both branches, but most of them are so badly attested that not much evidence of them has survived. We do have place names in some instances which help, but that's not much. So where do these languages come from? These are all Indo-European languages, the Baltic family. In the early times, and we're talking like 3000 BC, you had a series of tribes who were moving north from the steppes, and they became what would eventually become Proto-Baltic, branching off of the Indo-European family. By the year 1000 BC, there were dialects emerging out of this Baltic language. And also it should note that the Baltic languages are really close to the Slavic languages in many cases. They share a lot of the case systems. If you want me to get into that, put a comment down below and I'll try to answer your questions about the case system. But the fact of the grammar being quite complicated, I don't want to go into it in this video. The linguist Vladimir Toporov thought that the Baltic languages is what the Slavic languages, which eventually became Russian and Polish and Bulgarian, etc., formed out of. And what would have happened is a peripheral dialect in the east of the Baltic languages became Slavic. And at this point, Baltic and Slavic languages really begin to diverge. And also within the Baltic languages, there were dialects emerging, mainly between west and east. And this is before Lithuanian or Old Prussian emerged. Broadly speaking, the Baltic peoples were between the river Dnieper and the river Vistula in the west. Their territory began to shrink. But by the 1st century, in the writings of Tacitus, the Roman historian, we get evidence that a Prussian people existed. In this time, in the 1st century, they were called Aestians, which probably had to do something with the lagoon around the estuary of the river Vistula, which is the main river in Poland, around which the Prussian peoples were living. By the 9th century, the people called the Prussians were being referred to by the name Prussians. And this was the name that they called themselves. There's no clear agreement on what the name actually means. These were a pagan people. Their beliefs contrasted and clashed very deeply with the Christianity to the west and south. In the year 997, the Christian missionaries sent a man named Adalbert from Prague to try and convert these peoples. And, well, they killed this man. They killed quite a few missionaries who entered in their lands. Their beliefs were quite different from Christianity. The word Rulamova, or Ramava, is very close to many, well, frankly, Indian words and Sanskrit words, and this word is from their religion. It means a temple or holy place. The Christians obviously didn't like this, and over the next couple centuries, crusades began to wipe out the Prussian religion and to forcefully convert them and to conquer their territory. The 13th century, it was very violent for them. The Teutonic Order was used by the German principalities to conquer their lands, and by 1283 they were conquered. And also in 1295, just like in Wales, the Old Prussians rebelled again. There was a leader named Heraclius Mantas, and he led the Great Uprising, which lasted for 14 years from 1260. That's a long time to fight a guerrilla war. And this was a devastating war for the Prussian people. After this, they were subjugated and basically an oppressed people, reduced to serfdom, and their language, as a result of that, was not really implemented in any institutions of authority. And from this point, over the next 400 years, it began to decline, but not without some flowering. Just to give you an idea how close Baltic would be to Slavic languages, and since Old Prussian appears to be the most archaic and conservative of the Baltic languages, let's just compare how close some are to modern day Slavic languages. So the word for a linden tree in Old Prussian is lipe, but in Polish it's lipa. It's just practically a change of accent. So given that the Prussian or Old Prussian language was extinct by the early 1700s, what do we have left? Well, to start, in the medieval times, the east and especially northeast of Europe, given that it was pagan, had not been introduced to any thorough extent to the written, learned Christian traditions, which were based largely around writing. The pagans would have resisted these notions and these ideas to some extent, and in another way, the technology had not been introduced to these people early on. But on top of that, given that it went extinct before really the beginning of the early modern period, what's left is probably just a small amount of what was written. All we have are just fragments of what has survived, as has happened in many languages. But also what has survived is quite remarkable, because the oldest written evidence in any language of the Baltic family is not from Lithuanian or Latvian, which survived, but from Old Prussian. And this comes from the year 1369, which for Eastern Europe is remarkably early. And what it is, it's a joking inscription in a larger manuscript, probably by a student studying in Prague, where this manuscript comes from. There was a university even there at the time, and a lot of Prussians would have been sent to study there. And what this says is, "Cheers, sir. You are no longer a good little comrade if you want to drink, but do not want to give a penny." This was a very lively language at the time. People were making jokes in it. But at this point even, the Old Prussians had been conquered as a people by these Teutonic orders and slowly incorporated it into the emerging, what would eventually become the German state. We have other inscriptions found along the margins of the documents with little phrases like "Run, run, devils," or fragmentary texts which say words like "Hello, my friends." We don't know even the context of some of these sentences, but at least we're able to gather some more information about what the language looked like. From these we know that it had the evocative case, so words change if you're calling to someone. And this is common across all the Baltic languages. In fact, this language, we can see from these fragmentary documents that it has some older, archaic forms, probably even some other cases that have dropped out of use in modern Lithuanian and Latvian. A lot of these are religious in nature. As the Protestant Reformation came in, especially going into the 16th century, efforts were made to actively give minority languages writings of their own, as happened in the Welsh language, which actually saved the Welsh language. So there's not just a one-way direction of the Germans trying to extinguish the flame of this culture, which it did in a way, but later on it also tried to give it methods with which to be learned through the language. What we have are 3 catechisms, which are training guides in religious study essentially, and these together give us 64.5 pages of solid text in the Old Prussian language. This may not seem like a lot for all the access we have today to language at our fingertips, but put this into perspective, the first written language that has survived in the Romanian language comes from 1521. And so around the same time you get these catechisms emerging in Old Prussian. So we have more that has survived in Old Prussian from the period than has survived in Romanian. That's quite a feat for a language that went extinct. We get a few very brief, almost single-line poems, a couple longer. Perhaps the most important document for reviving the Old Prussian language into modern Prussian, this Albing vocabulary of 802 words, just a list of them with German next to it so we know what it means, is really important because a lot of these words are basic everyday words which you need to know to be able to speak a language. Among them are 56 words for types of animals, and 26 of these are fish names, which is apt because these were coastal people. And it's interesting that a lot of these come from different sources, these fish, in terms of languages that were influenced upon Old Prussian. You also get 67 words for types of birds, which is really important because, well, we see birds every day. So as you can see, that's not a lot that survived, but it is more than a lot of other extinct languages, frankly. So there's a lot there. Let's compare now how some of these words are similar to Lithuanian or Latvian, or where they're different. So in English you have room, but the word for window in Dutch is raam, and this appears to be a common root, a cognate. You have a lot of these happening between Lithuanian especially and Old Prussian. Look at this one. So in Old Prussian, this is the word for face, prusnam. But in Lithuanian, you get the word prusna for snout, and in Latvian you get prusnas for lips. So there's a big length there of the idea around a sound to create a word that evolved in different directions in these three languages, but kept a very similar meaning. Another way that these languages are similar is they absorbed influences from other languages in identical ways. Sometimes all three of these Baltic languages took the same loan word from another source, like they all took the word owl from Germanic languages. You get ilo, and in Lithuanian, ila, and in Latvian, ilens. That's interesting that they chose to take that one from a Germanic source. In other instances, they just have a common Indo-European root, the word to give. It's really similar in Latin-based languages. The word to give usually begins with a D, like don in French. And in Old Prussian, it's dat, or you get this datwe here. There's two versions here. And in Lithuanian, it's duoti. And in Latvian, dot. So you can see that there's definitely an Indo-European thing going on here. For instance, in earlier forms of Welsh, to use the word to give, you could say dodaf or dugaf. This D is common across a lot of languages. One feature that's really obvious in Old Prussian is that it began to absorb Slavic words to a greater extent at one point than were Lithuanian and Latvian. It was more in a Slavic neighborhood. The Polish peoples were expanding and they came into contact with them in a lot of different ways. So you get the word for beer. I guess they were having a drink together. So in Polish, the word for beer is piwo. And in Old Prussian, piwis. And in Lithuanian and Latvian, it comes from obviously what looks like a Germanic source. Alus and alaus in Lithuanian. So there were different cultural influences happening on Old Prussian that was beginning to push it away from the other two Baltic languages as it was, even though the Baltic languages, their closest relation for a lot of etymological roots was Slavic anyway. In another sense, you get German words coming into Old Prussian that weren't existing in the other Baltic languages, like the word for fire. We think it comes from Gothic in Old Prussian. So in Old Prussian, the word for fire is pano. Pano. And in Gothic, it was Tom. But in Lithuanian Latvian, it shares a common root there. It's ugnis and ugens. So what this tells us is that Old Prussian from an earlier stage was more multicultural. It was farther south and farther west, so it was exposed to cultures earlier on that the other Slavic languages weren't. And this may have allowed it to fight for a while longer, to hold on. As I said earlier, the 13th century was quite ruthless, and the Prussians were in constant war as they were being pushed out. And this ability to hold on so long, quite a small people, it's what allowed the Lithuanians and Latvians, the other Baltic peoples, to not be conquered so earlier on or not be assimilated. So it was the Prussian language dying off in a way that allowed Lithuanian and Latvian to survive. Now, don't mistake me, the Prussian language did not just die as soon as they were conquered after the Great Rebellion in the 13th century. It held on, but that act of defiance, holding off the Teutonic Knights for so long, it did give the other Baltic peoples a fighting chance. Today, there are a few dozen people who speak a modern form of Prussian, and it's called Modern Prussian, which is why Old Prussian is more correct now than it used to be. This is part of an effort by revivalists to save this heritage in some form. The linguist I mentioned earlier, Vladimir Toporov, said, "The extinction of Prussian is a loss to mankind and humanity. Therefore, it is a moral task to re-establish at least part of the vanished culture." I think that's a wonderful sentiment, to want to preserve and save one of humanity's cultures. And I wish them luck in reviving this language and encouraging more people to celebrate its culture. If you would like to learn more about that, I'll put a couple links down below. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time.